On a frozen mountain night, an old man was tied beneath the ancient pine outside his porch, snow gathering on his bruised skin, blood mixing with the winter wind as the men who wanted his land beat him again and again, shoving papers into his trembling hands, ordering him to sign away the sacred spring his family had guarded for generations. But miles away, through the storm's howl, a Navy SEAL and his German shepherd felt the night shift. A cold instinct rising in their bones, as if the mountain itself cried out for help. And when the truck's headlights sliced through the blizzard, destiny and betrayal collided. Because what the SEAL found under that tree wasn't just his father fighting for breath, but the first hint of a conspiracy powerful enough to poison an entire valley. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe courage still rises in the darkest storms, hit like, share, and subscribe for more stories where loyalty refuses to die. Winter clamped down on Pine Ridge, pressing the Colorado mountains into a hard white silence, while an old log cabin crouched beside a narrow spring that steamed faintly against the cold. Inside that cabin, Sam Walker moved like a man who had been broken and then stubbornly glued himself back together. He was 68, thick-shouldered once, now slightly stooped, his spine bent from decades of logging and one stupid moment up a tree when the harness slipped and the world turned upside down. His right leg never quite forgave that fall. It dragged half a step behind, and the weather found it first whenever snow came. Deep lines etched his face, but his eyes were a clear winter blue, watchful and stubborn in a way that made people think twice before offering pity. In his big, scarred hands, the metal coffee mug looked almost delicate. He sat at the small table by the window, watching steam rise from Angel's Spring. Locals had named it that long before his time. As a boy, he'd stood in that same spot, nose barely above the sill, listening to his father say that some waters were ordinary and some were touched by God. "This one keeps people honest, Sammy," his father had told him, resting a rough palm on his hair. "You don't bottle a blessing and slap a price tag on it." The memory warmed him more than the wood stove did. Now the spring was his to guard, and the weight of that felt heavier with every winter. He rose slowly, leaning on the worn hickory cane he'd carved himself during rehab, and limped to the door. Every step made his bad knee throb, but he refused to let the pain dictate his day. Pain, he'd learned, was just a loud neighbor. You didn't have to invite it in for dinner. Outside, the air bit his cheeks as he made his way to the spring with a galvanized bucket. The water was so clear he could see pebbles in the faint blur of his reflection, the white in his beard, the stubborn set of his jaw. He knelt with a grunt, feeling the cold stiffen his joints, and dipped the bucket. "Thank you," he murmured softly, steam curling around his fingers. "For one more morning." His voice sounded small against the mountains, but the habit of that prayer was carved as deep as the wrinkles on his hands. As he made his slow way back to the cabin, his thoughts drifted, as they always did, to his sons. Ethan Walker, 37, had been born with his mother's quiet eyes and his father's shoulders. Growing up, he'd been the boy who stood between smaller kids and trouble, who clenched his jaw instead of his fists until there was no other choice. The Navy had taken that instinct for protection and hardened it into something sharp. The SEALs had honed it further. The last time Sam saw him, Ethan's face had new angles, cheekbones sharper, jaw rough with a permanent shadow of stubble, like he never truly slept long enough to shave clean. There were faint lines at the corners of his steel gray eyes, the kind that didn't come from laughter. Ethan spoke little about what he'd seen overseas, but sometimes, on rare calls, Sam could hear it anyway. In the way his son paused before saying he was fine, in the way he always asked, "You got enough firewood up there, Dad?" Twice. Then there was Jake. Jake Walker, 33, had been a storm from the moment he learned to walk. Taller and leaner than Ethan, with the same high cheekbones but a softer jaw, boyish dimples that had once charmed half the town, and hazel eyes that could shine with mischief or go flat when drink got into him. As a teenager, he'd laughed too loud and drove too fast. As a man, he laughed less, drank more, and worked on job sites when they'd have him. Somewhere between a broken heart at 20 and a run of bad bets at a reservation casino, something hollowed out inside him. Sam could still see him at 16, fists clenched in the kitchen, shouting that he'd never be chained to a piece of land like his old man. that had cut deep, not because of the words, but because Sam recognized the wildness. He'd had to bury his own to keep food on the table. For Jake, the wild won more often than not. Back in the cabin, Sam set the bucket on the counter, poured some into a battered kettle, and lit the stove. On the table lay the latest letter from Crystal Rock Water. The paper was thick, the logo crisp, blue mountains, a shining droplet of water, a slogan about purity. It made his lip curl every time he saw it. They'd started with friendly offers. "We value your partnership, Mr. Walker. Imagine providing clean water to thousands while enjoying a comfortable retirement in town." When he'd said no, the tone had changed. "We urge you to reconsider before legal and environmental developments render your property unsuitable for residential use." Then the real messages came, not in ink, but in cut fencing, tire tracks where there should be none, power lines sliced during a storm, so that he'd spent all night feeding the stove, watching his own breath fog in the dark. Fear had crept around the edges of his mind, but something older shoved it back: pride, duty, and the knowledge that if he gave up the spring, he'd spend the rest of his life staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly he'd stopped being himself. That afternoon, the sky sagged lower, clouds piling on the peaks like bruises. By dusk, the wind had teeth, rattling the tin roof, whistling through unseen cracks. Snow came in hard, slanted veils that erased the trail to the road in minutes. Sam double-checked the lanterns, stacked wood by the stove, and tried not to think about how long it had been since he'd heard Ethan's voice or seen Jake's truck lights on the road. Loneliness was a familiar ache, but tonight it pressed heavier on his chest. He settled into his chair, cane leaning against his knee, listening to the storm build, telling himself it was just another winter night. He almost believed it, until the knock came. It wasn't the hesitant rapping of a neighbor or the urgent pounding of a rescuer. It was 3 hard blows that rattled the hinges, followed by a muffled curse as snow gusted under the eaves. Sam's heart stuttered. For a heartbeat, he sat motionless, feeling his pulse in his fingers, then pushed himself up, leg protesting, and limped to the door. "Who is it?" he called, voice rough. "Evening, Mr. Walker," a man answered, his tone warm in the way of someone who'd practiced sounding harmless. "Name's Carl. We're here on behalf of Crystal Rock's Community Support Division. Just want to talk, sir." Sam's grip tightened on the cane. He worked the deadbolt and opened the door a cautious crack. Snowflakes swirled in, clinging to the frayed sleeves of his flannel shirt. On the porch stood 3 men in heavy winter coats. The one in front, Carl, was in his mid-40s, broad-chested, with a neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard and a face built to look trustworthy. Deep-set brown eyes, strong nose, full mouth, curved in a salesman's smile. But there was something off in the eyes, a hardness that didn't match the charm. The storm had reddened his cheeks, but his gaze was cool and measuring, sliding over Sam and then past him into the cabin as if already taking inventory. To Carl's left hovered a thinner man, Reed, with a long neck and a narrow fox-like face. His blonde hair stuck out under his beanie in uneven tufts, and his pale blue eyes flicked constantly, from Sam's cane to the door chain to the dark woods behind the cabin. His jittery energy smelled like cheap coffee and nerves. The third man, Mason, loomed behind them, a head taller and thick as a tree trunk, his hood up, jaw shadowed, with several days' growth of dark stubble. A faded scar cut across his chin, disappearing into his collar. He didn't speak, didn't seem to need to. His mere presence said enough. Enforcer. Sam's stomach knotted. Then he saw the fourth figure half hidden behind their shoulders. Jake. His younger son stood hunched in his parka, shoulders drawn up against more than the cold. His brown hair, once kept in loose, cocky waves, was flattened by the wet, and several days' worth of stubble darkened his jaw. His eyes, those same hazel eyes that had once lit up whenever he talked about getting out of this town, avoided Sam's. Shame sat on his face like a bruise. "Dad," Jake muttered, stepping forward. His voice carried that familiar rasp, hoarse from too many late nights and too much whiskey. "We need to talk." A coldness deeper than the wind slid into Sam's bones. "Inside," Carl said smoothly, taking advantage of the opening, boot already nudging the door wider. "No sense freezing on the porch. We're here to help your family, sir." "Help." The word scraped. Within minutes, they were in the cramped living room, snow melting off their boots onto the threadbare rug. Carl shrugged out of his coat with the ease of someone who felt entitled to any room he walked into. Reed stayed close to the wall, rubbing his hands together, eyes cataloging exits. Mason just planted himself by the door like a slab of muscle carved from ice. Jake hovered near the table, not quite sitting, not quite standing, hands jammed deep into his pockets as if he could hide his own guilt there. Carl laid a folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal neatly stacked pages and a printed map with the spring circled in red. "Mr. Walker," he began, voice full of patient condescension, "you've been on this land a long time. We respect that. Crystal Rock respects that. But times change. You're isolated up here. Your health isn't what it used to be." Sam cut him off with a sharp look. "My health's between me and the Lord, not your concern." The older man's heart hammered, but his voice held steady. He could feel Jake's eyes on him, pleading, and that hurt more than the cold. Carl's smile tightened. "Your son's in trouble, sir. Deep trouble. Debts. Bad people involved. We clear those debts. You move into a nice place in town. Heat that doesn't depend on your back holding an axe. Doctors nearby. All it takes is a signature." He tapped the page with one manicured finger. Sam looked from the folder to Jake. "That true?" Jake's jaw clenched. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded, once, the motion jerky. "I messed up, Dad," he whispered. It's bad. They said this is the only way out." The room seemed to tilt. The storm howled outside, wind prying at the eaves like fingers. Inside, something older than fear rose in Sam's chest. Something like grief wrapped in anger. "This land isn't mine to sell," he said quietly. "It never was. It belongs to the one who put that water there, and to the folks down in the valley who drink from it. I won't sign. Not for you, not for anyone." Jake flinched as if struck. Carl's patient mask cracked. The smile vanished, revealing the flat calculation underneath. "You're making a mistake," he said, voice lower now, edged with steel. "Old men freeze fast in storms like this. Accidents happen. Pipes burst. Generators fail. No one would blame you if you just couldn't keep up anymore." Reed snickered under his breath. Mason's hand flexed at his side. Sam felt his cane pressing into the floor, the ache in his leg, the cold seeping through the logs. He also felt his father's hand on his shoulder from a lifetime ago and heard that same sentence about bottling blessings. His next words tasted of iron. "You can put all the threats you want in pretty envelopes," he said. "You'll get my name when hell freezes over." For a heartbeat, silence held. Then Reed moved first, slamming his palm into the old man's chest, knocking him back into his chair. The cane clattered across the floor. Pain flared bright in Sam's hip. Mason stepped in, a heavy fist, driving into Sam's ribs, another catching the side of his jaw. The world flashed white, then red. Jake shouted something. "Stop! Don't hit him like that!" But his voice sounded far away. The storm outside roared louder, as if the mountain itself objected. "Tie him," Carl snapped. "Maybe the cold will talk some sense into him." They dragged Sam from the chair, his feet scraping the floorboards, each jolt sending fire up his ruined leg. The front door exploded open under Mason's shove, wind and snow knifing into the warmth. They hauled him across the porch and down the steps, boots crunching on ice, to the great pine tree that had stood watch over the cabin longer than he had been alive. Its roots knuckled up through the frozen ground, and its lower branches creaked under the weight of snow. Reed looped a coarse rope around the trunk and Sam's chest, yanking it tight until bark bit through wool and into skin. Mason jerked his wrists behind him, binding them cruelly. Snow stung his face like a swarm of needles. He could taste blood in his mouth, copper and salt. His breath fogged in shallow bursts. "Last chance, old man," Carl said, leaning in close. His beard rhymed with frost, eyes dark. "Sign, and this all ends." Sam lifted his head with effort, blinking against the wind. Through the blur of falling snow, he saw Jake standing on the porch, arms wrapped around himself, eyes wide and glassy with horror. The man, looked split in two, torn between running to his father and running from the mess he'd helped create. Sam's chest ached, not from the blows, but from the sight of his child drowning in his own choices. "I'd rather freeze with my name clean," Sam rasped. than live warm on stolen ground. Carl's expression hardened into something ugly. He stepped back, pulling his collar up against the wind. "Then enjoy the night," he said, turning toward the cabin. The door slammed. The light inside shrank to a thin, golden line at the edge of the curtain, then disappeared. Alone, beneath the ancient pine, with the storm swallowing every sound, Sam let his head rest against the rough bark. Fear crawled icy fingers up his spine, whispering that this might truly be the end. But under it, something else whispered louder, a stubborn, quiet prayer that somewhere out in the white, help was coming, even if he couldn't imagine how. The rope bit deeper as the wind howled, and the mountain kept its secrets. The storm moved like a living thing across the Colorado highlands, swallowing the road in sheets of white, hurling snow against the windshield of Ethan Walker's pickup until the world outside existed only in fragments. Ghosts of pine trees, flashes of rock, the blurred outline of mountains collapsing into night. Inside the truck, the heater groaned and Max lay curled on the passenger seat, though lay was never quite accurate for him. The 5-year-old German Shepherd was always half alert, ears pricked, amber-brown eyes tracking every sound. His coat, thick black on the back, shading into warm brown along his legs and chest, gleamed even under the dull interior light, the sheen of a dog born for harsh weather and harder work. Max wasn't just trained, he was forged in crisis. A jagged scar ran along the edge of his right ear, barely visible under the fur unless the light hit it just right. It was the only visible reminder of the blast that had almost killed them both in Kandahar, a pressure wave that threw Ethan 20 feet into rubble and shrapnel, and Max, who, despite being wounded, dragged his handler by the vest into a ditch before the second detonation. Ethan had woken to sand in his teeth, blood in his eyes, and Max standing guard over him, wounded but refusing medical evacuation until Ethan was safe. Since then, the dog's presence had become the quiet rhythm of his life, the anchor he clung to when memories came at night, memories he never spoke of. Ethan's own appearance reflected that battlefield history. 37, tall and broad-shouldered, he carried his strength in a deceptively relaxed posture. His face was sharply cut, strong jaw, high cheekbones, a faint scar running diagonally from temple to cheek, left by a fragment of exploded metal years ago. His gray eyes were steady, but carried a restlessness that never fully faded, something like a storm behind glass. Military discipline showed in everything he did, from the precise way he gripped the wheel to the measured breaths he took when the truck skidded on the ice. Tonight, though, something gnawed at him harder than the winter air, a heaviness in his chest he couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the unanswered texts he'd sent Jake weeks ago, or the silence in his father's last voicemail, Sam saying something about a broken fence and strange men sniffing around. Ethan hadn't liked that tone, not one bit. Max suddenly lifted his head, ears snapping upright. A low growl vibrated in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Ethan muttered, leaning forward. Through the storm's frantic dance, a faint flicker appeared, light from the cabin porch, weak and tremoring, like a candle about to die. Then another shape, not a shadow, more rigid, human-shaped, unmoving. Ethan's grip tightened until his knuckles blanched. "No," he whispered. "Please, no." He slammed his foot on the gas. The tires fishtailed before catching traction, and the truck lunged forward. As they neared the cabin, the headlights swept across a nightmare carved out of white and darkness. There, tied to the pine in front of the porch, was Sam. Snow crusted on his eyebrows, his lips blue, face swollen from blows, eyes barely open. Surrounding him were 3 figures in thick coats, and behind them, half hidden like a child caught stealing, stood Jake. Ethan felt something tear inside him, a soundless snap that vibrated down to his bones. For a second, the blizzard went quiet around him. Max barked sharply, a command for blood and movement. Ethan flung the door open. "Stay," he barked, and Max froze instantly, muscles coiled, eyes blazing with restrained fury. The snow hit Ethan like a wall as he charged forward. Mason moved first, stepping toward Ethan with the swagger of a man who believed his size made him invincible. Mason's face was hard-edged, a brutish square jaw covered in days of coarse black stubble. He swung without warning. Ethan didn't hesitate. Training took over. He slid sideways, caught Mason's wrist, twisted, and drove his weight down. A sharp crack split the air. Mason howled, collapsing into the snow. Reed darted in next, his twitchy frame barely visible behind the swirl of white. His thin lips curled cruelly as he raised a bottle stuffed with a gasoline-soaked rag. "We'll burn it all," he shouted, thumb sparking a lighter. "Max," Ethan ordered. The German Shepherd exploded from the truck like a launched arrow, jaws clamping around Reed's forearm before the man could tilt the flame. Reed screamed, the bottle falling harmlessly into the snow, the lighter extinguished instantly. Max didn't shake or tear. He held with controlled, surgical precision, eyes locked on his handler for the next instruction. Then Carl stepped forward, the one with the polished mask. His salt and pepper beard glimmered with frost, his face a portrait of practiced confidence. But now, rage twisted it. He flicked open a folding knife, lunging with a snarl. Ethan's pulse slowed to a steady beat. 1. He sidestepped. 2. He seized Carl's wrist. 3. He wrenched it, forcing the knife to clatter into the snow. 4. He drove Carl face first into the ground, knee pressed into his spine. The storm howled around them as the three men writhed, their power shattered under the weight of one man and his dog. Jake stumbled forward, eyes red, breath shaking. "Ethan, I didn't know they'd go this far." Ethan didn't look at him, couldn't. Instead, he cut the rope binding his father. Sam's weight sagged against him, a groan escaping his numb lips. "Dad, I'm here," Ethan murmured, voice breaking in a way he hadn't let happen since he was a boy. Max stood close, pressing against Sam's legs, whining softly. Inside the cabin, Ethan wrapped Sam in blankets while Jake hovered in the doorway as if afraid the room itself would reject him. The sheriff arrived eventually, a stocky man with thinning hair and a gut that strained against his winter coat. Sheriff Tom Brenner, mid-50s, with tired, washed-out eyes that spoke of too many compromises. He scratched his chin, avoiding Ethan's gaze as he surveyed the three tied men. "Looks like a disagreement gone too far," he muttered. "Property issue." "They tortured my father," Ethan said, voice low. "They tied him to a tree in a blizzard." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "Well, best to let the court sort it. Don't escalate things." Ethan looked at him, and something cold settled in his eyes. Not the storm outside, but something older, sharper. He realized then the real enemy wasn't just the men in the snow. It was something much larger, much darker, and it wasn't going away. Morning rose slowly over Pine Ridge, pale and metallic, the kind of cold light that felt more like a warning than a beginning. The storm had passed, but left behind a world carved from ice, snow piled in soft, deceptive drifts, the sky a low ceiling of gray steel, and the air brittle enough to sting the lungs. Ethan Walker stepped out of the cabin with Max at his side, each crunch of his boots echoing the unease simmering beneath his calm exterior. He barely slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw his father tied beneath the pine tree, frost crusting his beard, those normally sharp blue eyes dimmed by pain. Rage had kept Ethan awake, but so had guilt. Guilt that he hadn't come sooner, hadn't checked in often enough, hadn't realized what Jake had gotten himself into. Max padded ahead, nose tilted into the wind, ears flicking at every sound. The German Shepherd seemed different this morning, tenser, as if the storm last night had awakened some buried instinct. His breath puffed in tight streams, the fur along his spine prickling. Ethan followed the dog toward Angel's Spring. The water still flowed despite the winter, sending up a faint haze of steam that curled in the cold air. But something felt wrong. The scent, the silence, the stillness. Max froze near the edge of the spring, lowered his head, and let out a rumbling growl that vibrated through the snow. Ethan crouched beside him. "What do you smell, buddy?" Max didn't look away from the ground. His nose pressed deep into the snow, paws scraping aside the powder until a dull metallic surface glinted beneath. Ethan brushed away the remaining snow with his gloved hands, and his stomach clenched. A pipe, long, thin, and newly welded, the seam still sharp. It snaked out from the tree line and burrowed directly into the heart of the spring. When he touched the metal, his fingertips tingled with the sharp odor of chemicals. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. He scooped a handful of water into a jar from his pack, clear at first glance, but when he lifted it to the light, faint bluish streaks shimmered inside. Not natural, not safe. He felt his jaw tighten with the cold precision that had kept him alive in war zones. Someone hadn't just wanted the land. Someone was willing to poison the valley to get it. Back inside the cabin, Sam sat wrapped in blankets by the fire, jaw bruised, one eye swollen but still burning with stubbornness. Jake hovered near the stove, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow with exhaustion and shame. The moment Ethan entered, the room stilled. "It's worse than we thought," Ethan said. "Someone's piping chemicals into the spring." Sam's fingers tightened around his cane, the knuckles pale. "They're killing the mountain." Jake's eyes flickered, a spark of disbelief mixed with dread. "Dad, I didn't know, I swear. They said it was just business." Ethan didn't answer. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through contacts until he found the name he needed, Dr. Laura Bennett. Laura was 42, a hydrologist with the EPA. Sharp-minded, sharp-tongued, and sharp-featured too. She was tall, with a lean, athletic build that came from years of hiking into riverbeds and climbing out of toxic ditches. Her chestnut hair was streaked with gray near the temples, not from age, but from stress, the kind that came from fighting corporations with too much money and too little conscience. Her skin was olive-toned, sun-marked from field work, and her hazel eyes held the weary steadiness of a woman who'd seen too many reports doctored, too many warnings ignored. She answered on the second ring. "Ethan, I told you only to call if something was wrong." "Yeah," Ethan said tightly, "it's wrong." He explained what he found, the pipe, the odor, the discoloration in the sample jar. Laura didn't interrupt once. When he finished, she exhaled sharply. "I'm on my way. Don't touch anything else." An hour later, a silver SUV pulled up, wheels crackling through the frozen ruts. Laura stepped out wearing a heavy parka over her EPA field uniform. Her face tightened when she saw Sam's injuries. "They did this?" Sam chuckled darkly. "You should see the other fellas." Laura knelt beside the spring, unscrewed the jar Ethan collected, and ran 2 rapid tests. The strips changed color almost instantly. "Industrial sanitizers," she said, voice low. "High concentrations. This isn't runoff. This is deliberate." Jake swore under his breath. Ethan felt his pulse beat in his ears. "Crystal rock?" Laura didn't answer directly. Instead, she stood, brushing snow from her gloves. "We need evidence. Documents, paper trails, permits. No agency approves a pipeline like this legally." Sam tapped his cane on the floor. "They count on folks like us not knowing where to look." "Then it's good we've got help," Ethan said. Laura smirked faintly. "I brought more than my test kit." Moments later, another vehicle rolled up, a beat-up red Jeep coated in road salt. Out jumped Megan Cole, 30 years old, local journalist for the Clearwater County Chronicle. She was shorter than Laura, slim but wiry, built like someone accustomed to chasing leads on foot. Her skin was fair, lightly freckled, and her thick, dark brown hair was tied back in a ponytail that looked like it had been redone 3 times during the drive. Green eyes, bright and curious, scanned everything at least twice. She had a camera bag slung over her shoulder, the strap patched with duct tape. Megan greeted Sam first, voice softer than expected. "Mr. Walker, I'm so sorry." Sam nodded. "You're the reporter stirring trouble in town." "Only when trouble deserves it." Inside the cabin, they spread documents across the table. Land records, state permits, water surveys. Some Sam had received, some Megan had dug up, some Laura had printed from agency databases. Jake sat, off to the side, head bowed, shame rolling off him like smoke. Every now and then, his eyes flicked to Sam, searching for forgiveness he hadn't earned. Laura traced a finger over one permit signature. "This inspector retired 3 weeks after approving Crystal Rock's expansion," she said. "Bought a house in Florida, cash." Megan snorted. "Must have been one hell of a pension." Ethan leaned forward, tension etched into every line of his face. "There's more. Max found something else." He lifted a small camouflaged object from the counter, a tiny camera. The lens cracked where Max had nudged it free from a tree trunk behind the cabin. He popped the memory card into his laptop. The footage appeared. Men in black jackets, snow swirling around them, the Crystal Rock logo faint on their sleeves. Then a voice, smooth, authoritative, unmistakably powerful, filled the cabin. The old man's land is the last piece. If he doesn't sell, let winter take care of him. Victor Hale, CEO of Crystal Rock Water, a man whose face decorated billboards, charity galas, and clean water campaigns. The cabin fell dead silent. Sam's hand clenched around his cane until his knuckles blanched. His eyes, swollen from the beating, still burned with a fire that made him look younger for a moment. "So that's the kind of men we're dealing with," he whispered. Ethan felt something settle inside him. Not fear, not anger, but a resolve so sharp it felt like steel. He looked at Laura, at Megan, at Jake. "This isn't about land anymore," he said. "It's about justice." And the mountain, silent and ancient outside the frosted window, seemed to agree. Denver looked almost unreal beneath winter's hard glow, glass towers gleaming like frozen spears, streets washed in pale blue light, and banners flapping stiffly in the wind outside the convention hall. Ethan Walker stood across the street with Laura Bennett and Megan Cole, their breaths rising in white plumes as they watched crowds funnel through the entrance. The large digital billboard above the doors flashed Crystal Rock Water's new slogan, "Pure water for every home." Ethan felt a muscle tick beneath his eye. The phrase felt offensive now, like a knife disguised as a smile. Beside him, Laura zipped her parka higher. She had traded her field gear for dark formal clothing, a charcoal blazer over a high-neck sweater, black trousers, sturdy boots, polished enough to pass as dress shoes. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a neat, no-nonsense bun, emphasizing her sharp cheekbones and steady hazel eyes. She looked like a swordswoman sheathed in bureaucracy, dangerous only if you underestimated her. Megan, by contrast, tried to blend in with the crowd, though her personality resisted blending into anything. She wore a fitted olive coat with a belt cinching her narrow waist, dark jeans, and a wool scarf patterned with little snowflakes. Her green eyes darted everywhere, restless and alert, like a fox ready to pounce on a headline. Even in the bitter cold, a strand of hair escaped her beanie and whipped across her cheek. She pushed it back impatiently. "You know," she murmured, "this is either going to expose the biggest environmental fraud in Colorado's history, or get us all sued into oblivion." "Or both," Laura said dryly. Megan snorted. "I vote both." Ethan didn't speak. His jaw remained locked in that rigid way he'd developed during deployment, when silence was both shield and weapon. But inside, emotion churned so forcefully he could barely swallow. He kept seeing his father tied beneath the pine, snow frozen into his beard, breath shallow, eyes dull with pain. And above it all, the voice of Victor Hale, smooth, arrogant, ordering Winter to take care of Sam. The thought made Ethan's blood simmer. Hale was somewhere inside that building now, smiling into cameras, shaking hands with officials who had no idea, or did, and pretended not to, what their golden CEO had done. "We go in on my signal," Laura said. "Ethan, stay near the left aisle. Megan, you get the footage from the room as soon as the screens switch. I'll handle the AV booth." Her voice was calm, but Ethan knew her heart was racing. She hid nerves behind steel logic. Megan hid fear behind sarcasm. Ethan hid everything behind the steady breathing techniques the Navy SEAL program drilled into him until emotion obeyed the body's command instead of the other way around. They moved inside. The ballroom was vast, crystal chandeliers, polished floors that reflected the stage lights, a crowd of donors, journalists, and officials in tailored coats and glossy shoes. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with the faint chemical tang of too much disinfectant. On stage stood Victor Hale. The man himself looked exactly like he did on the promotional posters. Maybe better. He was in his late 50s, but carried himself like someone who believed aging happened only to lesser men. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dense silver hair combed in perfect waves, a clean-shaven jaw, and a face engineered for public trust. His suit, a deep navy, fit so flawlessly it might as well have been painted on. His eyes were icy blue, bright as polished glass, but empty in a way that unsettled Ethan every time he saw the man's image. Hale radiated confidence, money, untouchability. When he gripped the podium and smiled, the room leaned in as though he were royalty. "Ladies and gentlemen," Hale began, voice smooth enough to pour, "today marks a new chapter in our mission to bring clean water to every corner of America." His smile stretched wider. Responsibility, community, transparency. These are the values Crystal Rock holds dear. The LED screen behind him flickered. A ripple of confusion swept through the ballroom. Hale paused. Ah, he chuckled. Looks like our tech team is still warming up. The screen glitched again. Static, then black, then a grainy, snow-filled night. The same snowy night outside Sam Walker's cabin. Gasps echoed. Ethan's breath halted. And then, devastatingly clear, Victor Hale's own voice thundered through the speakers. The old man's land is the last piece. If he doesn't sell, let winter take care of him. The crowd erupted. Cameras flashed like lightning. People shouted over one another. Hale paled, his polished confidence cracking like thin ice. "Cut the feed," he barked. Behind him, the screen showed images of the illegal pipeline, workers dumping barrels marked with warning symbols into the water, signatures on falsified reports, and the footage of Sam tied beneath the tree. Megan raised her camera, snapping photos at rapid speed. Ethan saw her hands trembling, though her face remained fierce. On the second balcony, Laura watched from the AV booth, her eyes narrowed behind her glasses, her posture taut with focus. She looked almost regal up there, like a general orchestrating a coup. Security guards scrambled onto the stage, but before they reached Hale, the ballroom doors slammed open. A line of FBI agents swept in, led by a tall, dark-skinned man with a neatly groomed beard and eyes like flint. Special Agent Marcus Reed, known for his unshakable calm under political pressure and a reputation forged after exposing corruption in 2 other state agencies. He held up his badge. "Victor Hale," he called, voice echoing across the room. "You are under arrest for environmental fraud, bribery, conspiracy, and attempted harm to a civilian." Chaos turned to stunned silence. Hale stammered something, protests, excuses, but the words dissolved under the weight of evidence flashing behind him. Meanwhile, 2 state officials attempted to slip out a side exit, but agents caught them before they reached the door. The camera flashes intensified. In the cabin, miles away, Sam Walker watched the broadcast from his chair near the wood stove. Bruised but alive, wrapped in blankets, he looked smaller than usual, but his eyes shone with pride as Max rested his head on Sam's knee, tail flicking slowly. Ethan stood behind him, one hand on his father's shoulder, the tension that had gripped him for days finally loosening. "Your boys did right," Sam murmured. "Did what a man's supposed to do." Ethan swallowed hard. "We just told the truth, Dad." "Truth's what saves a place," Sam replied. "Truth and courage." By the time the broadcast ended, the illegal pipeline had already been ordered dismantled, the contamination sites tagged for cleanup, and EPA trucks were on standby to secure the spring. The battle wasn't over, but the tide had turned. Winter lingered over the valley in soft, fading breaths, thin veils of frost clinging to the pines like old memories refusing to leave. But the cold no longer carried the bite of dread. Instead, it felt like a season exhaling, releasing what had once been buried under fear, violence, and greed. A year had passed since the storm that nearly claimed Sam Walker's land. Now the cabin stood at the heart of a sanctuary. The wooden sign at the entrance read, "Wind Hollow Spring Preserve," the letters carved by volunteers whose calloused hands testified to a community finally reclaiming its soul. The EPA had declared the land protected, untouchable by corporations, immune to permits forged by corruption. The spring flowed clear again, its water sparkling like fragments of morning light scattered across stone. Jake Walker walked the same path he once avoided, the narrow trail along the streambed where he now kneeled weekly to gather water samples. 34 years old, leaner than before, with cheeks slightly hollowed from months of rehab and discipline, he wore the reflective vest of the Clearwater County Water Department. His brown hair was shorter now, trimmed with the simplicity of a man rebuilding from the ground up. The tremor that once shook his hands whenever shame overtook him was gone. In its place was a steady, controlled movement as he filled each vial. Jake took a breath and let the cold air burn his lungs. It felt like penance, but a cleansing one. He capped the vial and whispered under his breath, as though speaking to the stream itself, "I almost destroyed you, but I'm here now. I won't let anyone touch you again." The water gurgled in simple reply, and Jake almost smiled. On the open field beside the cabin, dogs barked, yipped, and tumbled through the snow. Ethan Walker stood in the middle of them, tall and broad-shouldered, his breath warm against the cold. He had traded his Navy SEAL fatigues for a flannel shirt layered under a thick winter jacket, but the military discipline remained etched into every movement. Precise gestures, measured steps, a stillness in his gray eyes that came from surviving things he never spoke about. The scars on his temple and forearm caught the winter light like pale silver lines, reminders that survival often came at a cost. His hand rested on the head of Max, who stood at his side like an aging king among young warriors. Max had weathered time with quiet dignity. His once vibrant black and brown coat had softened into streaks of gray around the muzzle, but his posture remained proud. At 6 years old, he carried himself with the composed assurance of a dog who had lived through chaos and come out wiser. The pups adored him. A pack of young German shepherds, 8 in all, with oversized paws and clumsy enthusiasm, bounded around him as he issued short, authoritative barks. Ethan watched with a grin, shaking his head. "Some things never change, huh, partner?" Max nudged his leg, softly, as if acknowledging the sentiment, before trotting toward the training posts. The Wind Hollow K9 Rescue and Training Center had risen from the old field like a second chance given form. Ethan had worked on it with his bare hands, hammering posts in the freezing cold, hauling wood, building scent tunnels, obstacle courses, and search grids. The place had become something between a refuge and a battlefield for healing, a way for both dogs and humans to learn how to breathe again. Sam Walker sat on his wooden chair on the porch, wrapped in a thick brown coat that swallowed his still slight frame. 68 had worn him down physically, his back permanently bent from the logging accident, his legs weakened, but his spirit stood taller than ever. His beard had grown whiter, but his blue eyes remained sharp beneath the brim of his old wool cap. The steam from his mug curled into the air like a quiet blessing. From the porch, he watched Jake test the water, watched Ethan command the pups, watched Max trot like a guardian between two worlds. A warmth spread through his chest, something long overdue. "Look at them," he muttered. "My boys. Lord knows I never taught 'em much except how to swing an axe. But somehow they went and chopped down greed itself." Ethan laughed, approaching the porch as Max fell into step at his side. Wouldn't have happened without an old man stubborn enough to say no when it mattered. Sam snorted. Stubborn gets a man in trouble too. But there was pride in his tone, mountain solid, unshakable. Jake finished sealing his samples and walked over, boots crunching softly. He lifted a vial toward the light. "Clean," he said simply. "Cleaner than us, if you ask me." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Speak for yourself." Jake chuckled, a low, honest sound that had been missing from him for years. Afternoon settled over the valley, tinting the snow in soft gold. Dogs barked in the distance, their voices echoing between the pines like a strange choir. Sam closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him. The laughter of his sons, the steady steps of Max, the whisper of the spring flowing across the rocks. In the hush of that moment, he whispered to himself, "Miracles don't always come in thunder. Sometimes they come from an old man who refused to sell his land, and 2 boys who finally learned the difference between right and easy." The spring glimmered, flowing steadily, unbroken. Winter remained, but it no longer felt sharp. In the cold air lingered the warmth of forgiveness, redemption, and a family rebuilt. Held together by an unyielding man, 2 sons who had stumbled but risen again, and a faithful German shepherd who had guided them through every storm. In the quiet of Wind Hollow, where the winter wind carries the memory of storms long past, one truth lingers like a soft hymn over the valley. Miracles do not always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come as a stubborn old man who refuses to surrender what is sacred. Sometimes they come as 2 sons who learn to walk the hard road back to righteousness. And sometimes they arrive on 4 paws, wrapped in loyalty so pure it feels like God's own whisper in the snow. For those who pause and listen, the spring flows with more than water. It carries forgiveness. It carries healing. It carries the reminder that God still moves quietly through our everyday lives, through the hands that choose to protect, through the hearts that choose to forgive, through the small acts of courage we often overlook. And if Wind Hollow teaches anything, it is this: no winter is too cold and no night too long for grace to find its way through. because where love stands firm, God stands beside it. So as you finish this story, may the same blessing rest upon your home. May your storms pass. May your springs run clear. And may God's hand guide you gently through every valley you face. If this tale touched your heart, I invite you, share it with someone who needs a reminder of hope. Leave a comment about the miracle you're praying for today, and subscribe to join us for more stories where faith still wins, love still heals, and the quiet grace of God still walks beside those who believe. May the Lord bless you, protect you, and keep you warm through every storm. Amen.